Two nations, two flags, two proud identities. But ask most people what the DNA underneath actually looks like, and you'll hear the same answer every single time. Basically identical. Celtic cousins, practically twins, split apart only by a narrow stretch of sea and a few centuries of separate history. It sounds like common sense. It sounds like something everyone already agreed on long ago. But ancient DNA doesn't care what sounds reasonable. It doesn't bend to national pride, and it doesn't care about the comfortable story people have told for generations. When scientists actually sat down and studied the genomes properly, what came back wasn't a tidy tale of two identical populations. It was something far more textured, far more specific, and in places, genuinely surprising. The shared root really is there, deep and ancient and undeniable. But above that root, the branches split apart in ways that trace directly onto invasions, migrations, and isolated pockets of ancestry that hardly anyone talks about. In this video, we're going through it properly, where Scotland and Ireland's DNA genuinely lines up, where it splits apart, and exactly why. Let's get into it. To understand where the two populations diverge, you first need to understand where they began, because at the deepest level, their story starts out almost identical. Both islands carry the same three ancient layers that built nearly all of Atlantic Europe's population. First came the Western hunter-gatherers, the earliest inhabitants who moved in after the ice sheets pulled back, leaving only a small genetic trace in people today. Then came the Neolithic farmers, arriving from Anatolia and the Near East, bringing agriculture, permanent villages, and the massive stone monuments still standing across both islands. And finally came the layer that changed everything, steppe ancestry, carried in by the bell beaker culture roughly 4,000 years ago. This wasn't a slow, gentle mixing. On both sides of the Irish Sea, bell beaker migrants largely overwhelmed the existing farming populations, replacing most of their ancestry within just a handful of centuries. It's one of the sharpest demographic turnovers in the entire prehistory of these islands, and it played out in broadly the same way on both sides of the water. That's the foundation. Hunter-gatherer, farmer, steppe ancestry, layered down in that order on both islands at roughly the same time. It's why, at the deepest genetic level, someone from the Scottish Highlands and someone from County Clare are drawing from the same ancient wellspring. And it's why the popular assumption isn't wrong exactly, it's just incomplete. Because everything that happened after this shared foundation was laid down is where the two stories stop matching. Different invaders landed in different places, different regions stayed cut off from outside contact. Different kingdoms rose and pulled their populations in different directions. The root stayed the same. What grew out of it didn't. If the shared foundation is where the two nations agree, Anglo-Saxon ancestry is where they properly split, and the gap is bigger than most people realize. Scotland carries noticeably more Anglo-Saxon DNA than Ireland does, and it isn't spread out evenly. It's concentrated heavily in the south and southeast and the lowlands, where estimates run as high as 15 to 30% of total ancestry in some areas. That isn't a faint trace. That's a substantial layer woven directly into the genetic makeup of an entire region. The explanation goes back to a kingdom most people have completely forgotten ever existed, Northumbria. Centuries ago, this Anglo-Saxon kingdom didn't stay confined to what's now northern England. It pushed north, reaching up through the southeast of modern Scotland, as far as Lothian and the land around what would eventually become Edinburgh. Wherever Northumbrian control reached, Anglo-Saxon settlers followed, and over generations their ancestry became embedded in the local population. That expansion is still written into Scottish DNA today, more than 1,000 years later, in exactly the regions history says it should be. This is the first real crack in the idea that Scotland and Ireland are genetically interchangeable. Ireland never had anything comparable happen to it. There was no Anglo-Saxon kingdom pushing into Irish land, no equivalent wave of Germanic settlers folding themselves into the population the way Northumbria did across the lowlands. So while Scotland absorbed this extra layer directly into its southeastern core, Ireland simply didn't. And that one historical difference, a single kingdom's expansion into a single region, is enough on its own to create a measurable divide between two populations that otherwise share the same ancient root. It's a good reminder that history doesn't only get written into books, it gets written into the genome, and it stays there. This Anglo-Saxon layer doesn't just separate Scotland from Ireland either. It splits Scotland from itself. Draw a rough line through the country from east to west, and you find two genetically distinct populations living under a single flag. In the lowlands, especially toward the east, the genetic profile leans closer to northern England than to the rest of Scotland, the direct legacy of Northumbria's reach layered in over centuries and never fully washed out. But head west, into the Highlands, out toward Argyll and the Western Isles, and the picture changes completely. There, the genetic signature shifts toward what researchers describe as an insular Celtic pattern, one that lines up far more closely with Ireland and Wales than with Edinburgh or the Lowlands. In other words, Western Scotland genetically has more in common with Ireland than with its own southeast. That's worth sitting with for a second. Scotland isn't one genetic population wrapped inside one national identity. It's two separate lineages, shaped by two entirely different histories, that happen to share a border and a flag. The East picked up Anglo-Saxon ancestry through Northumbrian expansion. The West stayed anchored in the older, shared Celtic foundation, the same hunter-gatherer, farmer, and steppe layering that defines Ireland's ancestry too. This divide shows up clearly and consistently in the data, region by region, and it actually explains the earlier question. When people say Scotland and Ireland are genetically alike, they're usually picturing Western Scotland, the Highlands, Argyll, the Isles. That's the Scotland that mirrors Ireland. The Lowlands tell a completely different story, one shaped by a kingdom that pushed north long before Scotland existed as a nation at all. So, if Scotland's lowlands picked up a heavy dose of Anglo-Saxon ancestry, the obvious next question is why Ireland largely avoided it. The answer comes down to geography and distance. Northumbria's expansion simply never crossed the Irish Sea. Ireland's average Anglo-Saxon influence sits in the single digits, well under Scotland's lowland figures. There was never an equivalent kingdom feeding Germanic settlers into Irish territory generation after generation. The population that had already formed from hunter-gatherer, farmer, and steppe ancestry stayed largely intact, undisturbed by the kind of sustained Anglo-Saxon settlement that reshaped southeastern Scotland. But Ireland isn't perfectly uniform either. There's one region that breaks from the national pattern, and that's Ulster in the north. Ulster carries a noticeably higher concentration of outside ancestry than the rest of the island, and here the reasons are historical rather than ancient. Part of it traces back to the Plantation of Ulster, the organized settlement of Scottish and English colonists into the province centuries ago, layered on top of other historical movements that brought outside populations into the region over time. So even within Ireland, geography and history left clear fingerprints. Most of the island stayed fairly uniformly Gaelic in its genetic profile, while Ulster absorbed a distinct extra layer that sets it apart from Munster, Connaught, and Leinster. That creates a kind of mirror effect between the two countries. Scotland has its Anglo-Saxon heavy southeast and its more Celtic west. Ireland has its more uniformly Gaelic core and its more mixed north. Different scale, different history, but the same underlying rule. Wherever outside settlers moved in and stayed, the DNA remembers, whether that's Lothian in Scotland or Ulster in Ireland. Before going further into the differences, it's worth pausing on a piece of history that turned out to matter far less genetically than most people assume: the Normans. Their conquest of England in 1066 reshaped an entire nation. But their story in Scotland and Ireland is much quieter, and it's actually one of the rare places where the two countries line up almost exactly. Norman nobles did move into both countries in the centuries that followed. In Scotland, this happened largely under King David I, who granted land to Norman families as part of a wider restructuring of the aristocracy. In Ireland, Norman lords arrived following the 12th century invasion, carving out territory and founding new noble lines across parts of the island. In both cases, though, the genetic footprint left behind was modest. It wasn't a population-wide replacement the way the Bell-Beaker migration had been thousands of years earlier. It stayed narrow, confined almost entirely to elite families rather than spreading through the wider population. A farmer in the lowlands or a tenant in County Meath was extremely unlikely to carry meaningful Norman ancestry, even if the local lord did. It's a useful reminder that conquest and colonization don't always translate into deep genetic change. Political power can shift entirely. Castles can change hands, whole noble lines can be replaced, and still leave only a faint trace in the wider population's DNA. On this particular point, Scotland and Ireland genuinely match. Similar scale, similar limitation, similar concentration among the elite. The Normans reshaped the crown, they barely touched the genome. Now for the Vikings. And this is where the two countries tell one of their most interesting stories yet, because on the surface the numbers look almost identical, but underneath, the distribution couldn't be more different. Between the 8th and 11th centuries, Norse raiders, traders, and settlers pushed into both countries, and both were shaped by that contact in lasting ways. Averaged across the whole population, Ireland ends up with Scandinavian ancestry in roughly the mid-single digits, drawing from Norwegian, Danish, and Swedish-like sources. Scotland, taken as a whole, lands in a broadly similar range. On paper, that looks like another point of overlap. But averages hide the real story here, and the real story is about concentration. A landmark genetic study of Britain and Ireland found Norwegian-like ancestry running as high as 20 to 25% in Orkney and Shetland, among the most Norse-influenced populations found anywhere in Britain or Ireland. That's not a trace of contact. That's a population fundamentally reshaped by Norse settlement. Move to the Hebrides, and the figure drops sharply. Move further into the northern Scottish mainland and down into Argyll, and it drops again. Ireland, meanwhile, never produces a hotspot anywhere close to Orkney or Shetland. Its Norse ancestry spreads more evenly across the island, without the extreme spike Scotland shows in its northern isles. So the real difference here isn't really about the overall amount of Viking ancestry each country carries. It's about shape. Scotland's Norse history left sharp, dramatic peaks in specific places, with comparatively modest levels everywhere else. Ireland's Norse history left something flatter and more evenly spread, with no single region standing out the way the Northern Isles do in Scotland. Same raiders, same centuries of contact, completely different genetic fingerprint left behind. If there's one connection that ties Scotland and Ireland together more tightly than almost anything else in this story, it's what researchers call the Gaelic corridor, and the evidence behind it is stronger than most people realize. Genetic studies have identified a stable migration corridor running between the northeast of Ireland and the southwest of Scotland. A genetic link that has held steady for well over 1,000 years. This corridor didn't appear by accident. It reflects the real, physical back-and-forth movement of Gaelic-speaking people across the narrow stretch of water separating the two regions. The clearest historical explanation for it is the kingdom of Dal Riata, a Gaelic kingdom that flourished from roughly the 5th to the 9th centuries and straddled both coastlines, covering parts of Ulster on one shore and Argyll on the other. Dal Riata wasn't a border in the way we think of borders today. It was a single cultural and political zone that happened to stretch across two coasts. Families moved across it, warriors moved across it, monks carried religious learning between monasteries on both sides, traders kept goods and people in constant motion, and every one of those movements left a genetic trace, reinforcing the connection between northeast Ireland and southwest Scotland, generation after generation. That's why, even today, Western Scotland and northeast Ireland remain some of the most genetically similar regions anywhere in Europe. Not because they never diverged from each other, but because Dal Riata kept them woven together even while the rest of Scotland was absorbing Anglo-Saxon and Norse influence from other directions entirely. The corridor never really closed. It just became harder to see. That connection didn't stop reinforcing itself once Dal Riata faded from history. Centuries later, a very different kind of migration kept the same link alive, carried by some of the most formidable warriors of the medieval period, the Galloglass. These were elite mercenary families of mixed Gaelic and Norse descent, originating in western Scotland, where Norse settlement and Gaelic culture had already been blending for generations. Between the 13th and 16th centuries, Galloglass warriors crossed into Ireland in significant numbers, hired by Irish lords as professional soldiers. Many of them didn't just fight and leave, they settled, married into local families, and founded lineages that lasted for centuries afterward. Modern genetic research studying the same migration corridor has picked up this later historical signal directly in the data, noting a clear enrichment of Scottish and Galloglass-linked surnames, specifically within the southwest Scotland to Northern Ireland genetic community, a detail that lines up precisely with the historical record. Several surnames, tracing directly back to these Galloglass families, still cluster around Ulster and western Scotland today, exactly where the historical migration would predict. This is what makes the Gaelic corridor such a compelling case. It isn't just one migration event from over 1,000 years ago. It's layer stacked on layer. Dal Riata first, then Galloglass mercenaries centuries later, each reinforcing the same genetic pathway between the same two regions. Ancient Gaelic movement, medieval warrior migration, and later population flows, all stacked on top of each other, which is exactly why Western Scotland and Northeast Ireland remain some of the most genetically similar regions anywhere across the whole of Europe. Genetics doesn't just shape ancestry charts, it shapes the body, and when you look at physical traits and disease patterns between Scotland and Ireland, the pattern holds mostly similar, with a few sharp exceptions. Take red hair. Both countries carry some of the highest rates of red hair anywhere in the world, a legacy tied to their shared ancient ancestry. Scotland runs slightly higher than Ireland, but the gap is modest. This is one area where the popular assumption that the two are practically identical genuinely holds up. Disease rates tell a more revealing story. Hereditary hemochromatosis, a condition where the body slowly absorbs and stores excess iron, causing organ damage if untreated, shows a real divide between the two countries. Ireland has one of the highest rates of hemochromatosis anywhere in the world, with a meaningful share of the population carrying 2 copies of the responsible gene. Scotland's rate is lower, still high by global standards, but noticeably below its neighbor. This gap isn't random. Hemochromatosis has long been linked to Celtic ancestry specifically, and Ireland's more uniformly Gaelic genetic profile, less diluted by Anglo-Saxon ancestry and concentrated Norse influence, appears to have preserved a higher frequency of the gene across the general population. Scotland's additional layers, the lowlands Anglo-Saxon ancestry, And the sharp Norse concentration in Orkney and Shetland may have had a diluting effect on a condition rooted in the shared Celtic core. It's a striking example of how the deeper genetic differences traced through history, corridor by corridor, invasion by invasion, don't just show up in ancestry charts. They show up in hospitals, in diagnoses, in the actual health of the people carrying this shared ancient ancestry today. If ancestry percentages tell the broad story, Y chromosome haplogroups tell the fine print, and this is where the differences between Scotland and Ireland get genuinely specific. Both countries are dominated by the same paternal lineage, R1b, and more precisely by its L21 branch, the common thread running through nearly all insular Celtic populations. But within that shared branch, the two countries split into distinct sublineages, each tracing back to a different chapter of history. In parts of Western Ireland, L21 shows up at extremely high frequency, and one particular branch is concentrated heavily in Ulster, peaking in County Donegal, a region multiple studies have identified as the most genetically isolated area anywhere in Ireland. That branch traces back to the Uí Néill dynasty, one of the most powerful ruling families in Irish history, and it also appears more faintly in southwest Scotland, another quiet echo of the Gaelic corridor. Munster tells a different story, dominated by a branch linked to Brian Boru, the High King of Ireland in the early 11th century, traced through its own distinct marker. Scotland carries its own distinct branches entirely. One particular R1b subgroup runs noticeably higher in Scotland than in Ireland, especially in the southeast, and connects directly back to Germanic and Anglo-Saxon ancestry, the same layer that reshaped the lowlands centuries ago. Scotland also carries more of the Norse-linked haplogroups common across Scandinavia, elevated further by Orkney and Shetland's exceptional Viking ancestry. And Scotland has its own uniquely local branches too, some tied to specific Highland clans, others forming small, distinctive regional clusters found almost nowhere else. On the maternal side, the pattern repeats in miniature, with Scotland carrying slightly more of one lineage linked to Norse ancestry, and Ireland carrying slightly more of another. Small differences, but consistent ones, each pointing back to the same layered history. So where does that leave the question this all started with? Are Scotland and Ireland genetically the same? The honest answer is both yes and no, and that's not a dodge. That's the actual finding. Their Bronze Age Celtic ancestry, that shared foundation of hunter-gatherer, farmer, and steppe lineage, is overwhelmingly dominant in both populations and in a global context. Few, if any, European populations are more genetically alike than these two. That part of the popular story is true, but layered on top of that shared root are real measurable differences. Scotland absorbed Anglo-Saxon ancestry through Northumbria and concentrated Norse ancestry through its Northern Isles, while Ireland stayed more uniformly Gaelic, its own layers shaped instead by Ulster's plantation history and its own separate contact with Norse settlers. The Gaelic corridor kept Western Scotland and Northeast Ireland bound together, even as the rest of Scotland pulled in a completely different direction. So the two nations aren't identical twins. They're something closer to close siblings, raised from the same roots, but shaped by different experiences along the way. And that raises the obvious next question. If Scotland and Ireland are this closely related, what happens when you bring England into the same comparison? That's a story for another time.